President.
President. President. President. Election. President. Election. 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 President. Election. Election. History. President. Election. 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 Chamber. 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 President. President. Chamber. Chamber. Election. 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 Chamber. President. Chamber. Voters. Election. Election. Voters. Election. Election. Chamber. History. Chamber. History. President.
President. History. 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 President-elect's history. History. President. History. Election. President. Election. The voters. Chamber. Election. President. Election. Voters.
President. I'm the history. Chamber. Chamber. President. President. Chamber. History. History. Voters. History. Voters. Election. President. Election. Election. President. Election. History. History. Voters. Election. Election. President. Election. 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 Chamber. President.
President. History. 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 Election. History. History. President. Election. 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 President. Election. President. Election. President. Election. 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 President. 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 Election. Election. President. Election. 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 President. President. Election. President. 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 Election. President. President. Election. President. President. Election. 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 History. Election. 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 President. Voters. 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 Election. Election. Voters. Election. 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 Voters. Election. 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 President. Election. Election. Voters. Election. Voters. Election. Chamber. 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 History. History. President. Chamber. Chamber. History. 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 President. History. Chamber. Buttress. Chamber. 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 History. History. Chamber. Chamber. History.
President. I'm Chamber. History. President. 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 Election. Chamber. Chamber. President. Chamber. 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 President. Chamber. Chamber. Election. Chamber. Chamber. Election. The election. President. The election. President. The election. The election. 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 President. An election. President. Chamber. Voters. Election. The election. The election. The voters. Election. Voters. Election. State election. Voters. Election. Voters. Election. Voters. 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 Election. President. President. Voters. History. Chamber. 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 History. History. President. History. History. Election. 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 An election. Chamber. Chamber. Election. Chamber. President. I ask.